My pleasure to introduce Tristan Volpe, who's returning for a summary of some work he's had underway for a few years in his doctoral dissertation. Tristan, many of you know, was the leader of this cross-domain seminar series, so he's well known to many of you. I arrived at the laboratory in late April. He departed in April. I tried not to take offense at this choice of his. I'm not sure that there was a connection. He's moved on. He completed his tenure here as a Lawrence Fellow and completed the defense of his dissertation at George Washington University in May, and then moved on to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, where he's involved in project work in this area. Strategic latency is an interest of the center and of the laboratory. Understanding the degree of latency of Iran's nuclear capability is one of our principal projects these days. And understanding how to assure our allies so that our allies feel content with the latent posture they've developed and don't need to ramp it up a little bit somehow in anticipation of our failing to deliver on our strategic promise to them. These are highly salient policy questions today in both Central Europe, Southern Europe, but also Northeast Asia. So Tristan chose as a dissertation topic a few years back this topic of strategic latency, nuclear latency, and the policy challenges for the United States associated with the latent postures adopted by allies and friends of the United States. This is a rich and interesting and generally underexplored topic, and his dissertation, when it's published, will be one of the most important pieces of analysis and literature on this subject. Please join me in welcoming Tristan and look forward to his remarks.
Thank you, Brad. Well, that was a fantastic introduction, Brad. I'm very honored to be back here at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. This morning, I'm going to focus on an enduring international security issue that many of you from the laboratory have confronted over the years, as Brad mentioned, and that's the spread of enrichment and reprocessing technology. Since at least the first nuclear energy renaissance, it's been obvious, especially for members of the technical community, that countries capable of enriching uranium or reprocessing spent fuel can make the fissile material needed for a nuclear weapon. Yet the non-proliferation treaty regime does not prohibit countries from developing the so-called ENR technology so long as they implement the requisite safeguards to ensure peaceful use. The U.S. has therefore pursued additional measures over the decades designed to inhibit countries from surmounting this key technical choke point to the bomb. Indeed, the last two presidential administrations made it a priority to erect new barriers to the development of ENR technology. In a 2004 speech to NDU, President George W. Bush called into question the legal right of states to enrich uranium and reprocess plutonium. Bush argued that states that weren't already operating legal commercial ENR facilities ought to be prevented from acquiring this technology by the Nuclear Suppliers Group. Unfortunately, after this bud withered on the vine for a few years, the Obama administration tried a different bilateral approach. The White House argued that U.S. nuclear cooperation agreements, so-called 123s, should be conditioned on the recipient country forswearing enrichment and reprocessing technology. By baking these strict standards and conditions into 123s, this was supposed to usher in a new non-proliferation gold standard, especially after the UAE concluded such an agreement. But the White House found it difficult to convince Vietnam and Jordan, not to mention the South Koreans, to follow suit. So what's the best path forward when it comes to trying to limit the spread of this technology? My main argument here this morning is that the U.S. should make countries an offer they can't refuse. The next presidential administration should be willing to offer states, but particularly our allies, substantial packages of economic and military concessions in return for pledges to forego the development of ENR technology. To use a more pejorative term, the U.S. should bribe countries into renouncing their right to enrich uranium and reprocess plutonium. Now, to be sure, this transactional approach is not going to work with every country. Some might not be willing to give up entrenched nuclear programs, and it might not be possible to find the right mix of quids and quos to strike a deal. So the key question this morning is why and when should the US bargain with countries to buy out their demand for ENR technology? I'm going to provide an answer in three main parts. First, I'm going to make the case that many countries are quite keen, actually, on accepting nuclear buyouts and often play up the threat of proliferation to pressure more rewards from Washington. Some even retain, what Brad referred to as strategic latency, this option to produce nuclear weapons, because it provides a sort of trump card in negotiations at the bargaining table. But some are much better at cutting deals than others. So the second part of this talk is going to lay out a framework for explaining this track record of success and failure over time. Turns out that when it comes to compelling concessions from the US, my central claim is that there's an optimal amount of nuclear technology, a sort of sweet spot or Goldilocks zone, if you will, where the nuclear program is in the best position in terms of bargaining. I then use these findings at the end of my talk to pinpoint when US policy practitioners should bribe or buy out our allies into giving up enrichment and reprocessing programs. So let me turn to the foundational claim of my talk. Bribery or buying out our allies is a pragmatic non-proliferation strategy precisely because countries often use nuclear programs to try and extract large packets of concessions from the US. If we look back on the last 70 years of nuclear diplomacy, it's clear that both allies and adversaries have used the threat of proliferation to try and extract the biggest possible buyout from Washington. Indeed, the Cold War was rife with this sort of behavior, starting with bids by the West Germans and the Italians to gain a bigger foothold in NATO. In East Asia, during the 1960s, US officials found themselves negotiating a quid pro quo over Japan's nuclear future and the territorial reversion of Okinawa, which was seized by US forces during the Second World War. The South Koreans, a few years later, mobilized a nuclear weapons program from scratch in 1970 to back demands for greater US military commitment to their security after the Nixon administration decided to withdraw a division of troops from the peninsula. And towards the end of the decade, Pakistani officials quietly let the Carter administration know that they might forego the bomb if Washington offered them a formal mutual defense treaty. Officials in the Beltway at the time were, of course, well aware of what was going on. If you just look at this forecast from a recently declassified intelligence estimate, in 1975, the CIA wagered with near certainty that states would almost certainly exploit their threshold positions rather than their actual nuclear weapons capabilities. So after the Cold War ended in the 1990s, this behavior continued apace. North Korea used its plutonium program to extract a large package of concessions from Washington under the agreed framework in 1994. And in 2003, Iran embarked on a 12-year odyssey of nuclear diplomacy punctuated by defiant buildups in its enrichment program, which culminated in an unprecedented deal over the future of its entire nuclear complex this last July. And at the same time, over the last year, Saudi Arabia appears to have taken a page out of the old South Korean playbook by conjuring up an empty proliferation threat to pressure Washington for an enhanced security guarantee. So given the time and resources required to develop a viable nuclear option, it should come as no surprise that foreign governments often seek to extract side benefits along the way, whether they're developing a civil program or a military program. Now, to be clear, there's other important drivers that are influencing the decision to start or stop a nuclear program in the first place. And few leaders are pouring scarce resources into an enrichment or a processing capacity simply to accumulate a trump card or a negotiation chip. Yet it is possible to pursue multiple objectives at the same time. And the US is inclined to find a diplomatic solution whenever confronted with this sort of bargain. For Washington, the calculus is simple. Buying out a country's nuclear aspirations is less costly than preventive war and far more effective than pure containment. Furthermore, invading or abandoning an ally is never a pragmatic response to nuclear proliferation. But the US does not automatically cut a deal or bribe away every threat that pops up. Some countries are quite successful at coaxing Washington into providing them with large packages of goodies, while others fail to get much at all. So the second key claim here is that when it comes to cutting a deal, there's an optimal amount of nuclear technology for the other country, what I refer to as a sweet spot or a Goldilocks zone. Now, the crux of the issue analytically is that a country must have enough capability in place to put real and immediate pressure on Washington to provide a large package of concessions, while still being able to make a promise of nuclear restraint. As you can see in this simple table, this trade-off between the credibility of threats and assurances creates a sort of Goldilocks zone for cutting deals with the United States. With too little technology in yellow on the left, the threat to proliferate is simply not believable in the near term. In this talk, I'm going to discuss Saudi Arabia today and South Korea 4 decades ago to drive this key point home. But if the country builds up too much capacity to produce nuclear weapons, as you can see on the right, on the red, it becomes difficult to make a non-proliferation promise. North Korean behavior during the six-party talks, I think, is an excellent example of this quandary. But I'll also briefly discuss similar challenges faced by the Iranians over the last 5 years. Now, the US is inclined to comply with expensive demands when a country brings just the right amount of nuclear technology to the bargaining table, as you can see in blue in the center. North Korea was able to do this in the early 1990s, but also the Japanese were very adept at cutting this sort of deal with the US in the late 1960s and early 1970s as their nuclear fuel cycle was starting to come online. So I want to begin by driving home the point that if a country has too little technology, then the threat to proliferate is not credible. Now, this is obvious to most members of the technical community, but it's often lost in some of the policy conversations in the Beltway. You know, the country must have some nuclear capabilities in place to follow through on the threat within a short period of time. Otherwise, any leader could simply conjure up a nuclear program in an attempt to get a large payout from Washington. Let's consider Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabian nuclear program over the last 5 months. Over the last year, the Saudis have been pretty effective at stoking a persistent fear in Washington that the Iran nuclear deal is going to spark a sort of atomic chain reaction in the Middle East. High-ranking Saudi officials have promised to match Iran's enrichment capabilities and claim that, quote, all options are on the table as they confront Iran in a regional power struggle. Now, these not-so-veiled threats to proliferate have been timed to coincide almost precisely with demands made during alliance consultations with US officials. This sort of bargaining stratagem was on vivid display in May as Saudi officials prepared for a summit at the White House in Camp David. In preparation, the Saudis made their expectations clear. As the New York Times reported, they wanted a formal defense treaty with the US pledging to defend them if they came under external attack. This demand came on the heels of several public threats to match Iran's enrichment capabilities. Now, the key weakness with the Saudi ruse is that the kingdom currently lacks the technical means to follow through on the threat in the short term. Saudi Arabia has several small research centers, but no infrastructure or real ability right now to produce fissile material. Even if the Saudis developed an enrichment capacity in, let's say, 10 years, this doesn't provide them much leverage right now as they're making these demands at the White House. Now, some have suggested that the Saudis could call in a favor to Pakistan, since the kingdom allegedly financed Islamabad's nuclear weapons program. Yet Pakistan faces strong disincentives to support Saudi proliferation in the near term. Islamabad badly wants to emulate India by proving it's a responsible nuclear power and aspires to join the group of nuclear suppliers that have pledged not to export any enrichment or processing technology to the Middle East. Now, speculation always abounds over the old Saudi-Pak connection, but the key point is that it's not going to help the Saudis today suddenly jumpstart an enrichment program as they make these demands and try and extract as much as possible from Washington. Now, the White House ended up calling out the Saudi nuclear bluff after the Camp David summit in May. President Obama reassured the Saudis that the American commitment to Gulf security was, quote, ironclad, but he stopped short of offering the formal defense pact that they had requested. Instead, concrete deliverables focused on helping the Saudis build up their own internal defenses as they confront Iran. The Saudis were disappointed and let this disappointment be known to the press, but they didn't leave the summit empty-handed. U.S. officials worked for the next several months to provide a package of conventional arms that was recently concluded 2 weeks ago that's valued at about $1 billion. U.S. officials undoubtedly knew that they could provide more modest, low-cost deliverables now to try and buy out this threat rather than wait until Saudi Arabia spends enough to develop a real enrichment capacity and put an actual hand on the bargaining table. So beyond just rebuffing demands, though, Washington can most effectively stop a nuclear weapons program if a country threatens to proliferate before it has the technical building blocks in place. In the 1970s, premature threats from South Korea provided U.S. officials with a prime opportunity to dissuade and deny the development of sensitive nuclear technology. At the time, the South Koreans were shocked by Nixon's decision to withdraw an entire division of troops from the peninsula, as I mentioned at the outset. The president of South Korea at the time, General Park, appears to have concluded that while he couldn't reverse this withdrawal, he needed to develop a sort of nuclear trump card to have in his hand in case the Nixon or Ford administration decided to withdraw more troops or support. Park therefore added an explicit military dimension to South Korea's plans to develop the civilian nuclear fuel cycle by creating 2 new weaponization and defense agencies in 1970. Now the problem, again, and this is similar to the Saudi Arabian case, is that aside from a small research reactor, South Korea at the time had no major nuclear infrastructure or ability to produce fissile material. Park mobilized a massive effort to get the technical building blocks of the back end of the fuel cycle in place as quickly as possible. And by 1974, this started to come to fruition as South Korea signed contracts with several European suppliers, most prominently the French, for a nuclear reactor in our processing facility. The problem is that these efforts sounded a proliferation alarm in Washington. Recently declassified cables show in great detail how U.S. officials estimated that they had a very good chance of slowing down and indeed stopping the South Koreans precisely because they could inhibit access to this sensitive technology and equipment. And on the diplomatic front, Washington decided to match these efforts with a more explicit course in a series of direct, early, and firm démarches over the nuclear issue. Now, Park still tried to play his hand several times throughout 1975 by making numerous public and private requests that were matched with threats to potentially move further down the plutonium pathway. And he was asking for greater U.S. capabilities and resolve to South Korean security. But the nuclear bluff at the time proved to be counterproductive as U.S. officials ramped up pressure on the South Koreans to cancel the contract for the reprocessing facility. Park tried to refuse for several months, but by December 1975, the Ford administration authorized what is the strongest démarche ever issued to South Korea, which is that they would review the entire range of security and political relations with the South Koreans if they continued along the path towards a plutonium option. Park, in response, agreed to cancel the contract for the reprocessing facility. Now, the key point here is that Saudi Arabia and South Korea did not have the nuclear infrastructure in place to put enough pressure on the U.S. to comply with expensive demands. Instead of extracting concessions, both countries made it more difficult to then procure sensitive nuclear fuel cycle technology by essentially announcing intent to proliferate. The lesson is straightforward. If you want a big bribe from Washington, don't play the nuclear card unless you can actually make the bomb. So if nuclear bluffs are counterproductive, then perhaps the country should move closer to the bomb to get the most concessions possible from Washington. On initial consideration, it does seem as though being a screwdriver turn away from the bomb should put the burden on the U.S. to cut a deal before it's too late. Once a country has either the capability to produce large quantities of fissile material or actually produces plutonium or large amounts of HEU, Washington may offer a much bigger payout in a final effort to inhibit proliferation. But Thomas Schelling's classic work on coercive diplomacy and bargaining reminds us that these sort of compellant threats need to be backed up with a credible commitment of restraint. Otherwise, there's simply no inducement for the US to comply with any of the demands. The problem is that it becomes increasingly difficult for the challenger to offer such an assurance that they're going to restrain themselves and not move closer to the bomb as they develop more nuclear technology. Now, the most obvious challenge is that the requirements of cutting a deal go up quite a lot as a country builds up more nuclear technology. So let's focus for a few minutes on Iran's attempts to cut a deal in 2010, which I think provides the cleanest possible example of this challenge. So in October 2009, American and Iranian teams met on the sidelines of a meeting in Geneva to try and negotiate a confidence-building measure over the future of Iran's nuclear program. Now, at the time, Iran had about 1,500 kilograms of LEU, along with the centrifuge capacity to enrich this further into enough HEU for a single nuclear weapon. So the Americans proposed a simple trade. If Iran shipped most of the LEU out of the country, then the US would help them secure a contract for a research reactor in Tehran that needed to be fueled. The Iranians initially accepted the parameters of this deal, but greater forces, let's say in Tehran, eventually overruled the deal. So after the deadlock in Geneva, the Iranians embarked on a defiant 7-month increase in the quantity and disposition of enriched uranium, perhaps in an attempt to put themselves in a better position. But by April 2010, the US had put together a multinational coalition that was about to sanction Iran over the nuclear issue. So the Iranians attempted to revive the old deal from Geneva that was proposed in October 2009 in an attempt to stave off these economic sanctions. But the problem was that Iran now had close to 2,300 kilograms of LEU. So removing 1,200, as the original terms of the deal stipulated, would still leave them with more than enough to produce HEU for an atomic weapon. The Iranians had essentially diluted the value of their non-proliferation promise, and most crucially, they refused to update the terms of the agreement. So the US rejected the deal, and instead of increasing their bargaining power, the Iranians essentially catalyzed harsh multilateral sanctions. Now, to be sure, the deal that was just struck in July underscores that a country in Iran's position can always meet these non-proliferation requirements if they so desire. After 3 years of enduring sanctions while continuously building up their enrichment program, the Iranian leadership decided to cut an interim deal in November 2013, and the final agreement concluded over summer was based on an unprecedented mix of requirements designed to constrain Iran's ability to produce nuclear weapons, most notably continuous monitoring over key facilities and all imports that are nuclear related into Iran. Since promising restraint is onerous with so much nuclear technology, the leadership must be willing to pay the necessary cost to cut a deal. Now, this is straightforward. The more interesting point is that beyond just the terms of the deal is another very important domestic cost. The leadership must pay a high political price at home to trade away a mature nuclear weapons program. Let's take a look at North Korean behavior during the six-party talks. After the North Koreans produced large amounts of plutonium for several years and tested a nuclear device in October 2006, US officials came around to eventually offering a viable plan for the North Koreans to disable much of their nuclear infrastructure in return for phased rewards. Now, the DPRK took some of these initial steps, but eventually decided that the juice simply wasn't worth the squeeze and refused to disable or dismantle any elements of their nuclear program. Now, it seems plausible that the North Koreans always wanted a nuclear deterrent, especially considering where we are today with the North Koreans. So perhaps diplomacy at the time was simply a clever ruse designed to extract side benefits, and maybe it ended up revealing their true intentions to acquire a nuclear force. But there's another, let's say, more nuanced read of what happened during the six-party talks. That's that maybe an influential group of regime elites have become steadily vested in the success of this nuclear program over its many decades of development. Given the model of regime survival in North Korea, the leadership would find it risky and dangerous to trade away what had become the most valuable commodity in the country. The nub of the issue is that a nuclear program tends to lock in or entrap the leadership of a country into a specific course of action the more it matures into an operational capability. This is because nuclear technology exhibits what economists refer to as path dependency. Each technical step a nuclear program takes towards the bomb makes it more difficult to reverse course or reorient the program along a different path. The scientific nuclear complex may become entrenched in the political system and seek to retain generous budget outlays year after year. Politicians may accrue power from managing these operations. And as the ultimate customer of nuclear technology, military officers may push for some sort of tangible return on their long-term investment. So the path-dependent nature of nuclear technology means that the leadership will become reluctant to trade away the nuclear program as it matures. The government could always implement the terms laid out by the US, just as the North Koreans could have lived up to the plan we proposed to them in February 2007. But since the nuclear program generates increasing returns over time, the leadership finds it can't incur the domestic costs to trade away this asset. So a country's nuclear program provides the most leverage when it brings just the right amount of nuclear technology to the bargaining table. The leadership needs to have enough capability to back up its threats while also retaining the political flexibility to assure the US that compliance is going to be rewarded with nuclear restraint. That is, the bribe that we're giving them is actually going to get us something tangible in terms of limiting their ability to produce fissile material and hence nuclear weapons. Now, a country can pull off this delicate mix when its nuclear program enters the Goldilocks zone with an emerging capacity to enrich uranium or reprocess plutonium. The key advantage of being in the fissile material sweet spot is that the leadership can lock the emerging program into a benign or civilian course, rather than having to reverse a mature weapons complex away from an operational capability. Now, this holds for allies and adversaries, democracies and autocracies, and across a wide range of demands. I'm only going to focus on North Korea for the final example of this talk, but I'm happy to discuss other cases, especially Japan's efforts during the 1960s during the Q&A. So, North Korea. They entered this fissile material sweet spot in 1991 when construction on a very large plutonium reprocessing facility neared completion. The US opened a diplomatic channel to try and resolve the nuclear issue, and in response, the North Koreans explicitly manipulated the plutonium program on several occasions to try and extract the largest possible package of concessions. In the most striking instance, North Korea announced that it would begin to separate plutonium because, quote, Washington had no intention of buying them out, end quote. North Korean officials then started a ticking clock by announcing that it would take 2 months for them to unload all of the spent fuel from the reactor and move it over to the reprocessing facility to be separated. This explicit brinksmanship indicates that the North Koreans may have recognized the leverage provided by being in this technical Goldilocks zone. Now, the ultimatum did end up revealing Washington's bottom line, as US officials contemplated a preventive military strike on North Korea's nuclear program in the summer of '94. Now, before the situation could escalate out of control, the unauthorized and unexpected visit of President Carter provided Kim Il-sung an off-ramp to strike a deal. The US agreed to buy out North Korea's plutonium program with a package that consisted primarily of $50 million each year in heavy fuel oil, and eventually we would provide 2 modern light water reactors valued at $4 billion. In return, North Korea agreed to freeze plutonium operations, seal the facility for eventual dismantlement down the road, and remain party to the NPT. Now, North Korea was able to strike a low-cost and high-reward bargain with the US precisely because their program was in this sort of emerging technical sweet spot. In 1994, the US paid North Korea to freeze its operations with the expectation that they would disable and dismantle the plutonium facility several years down the road. This was a very modest price for them to pay. North Korea avoided military attack and was able to reap badly needed energy assistance at the time without having to really make a tough decision whether they wanted to give up a mature capability. From the North Korean perspective, we don't know for sure, but it probably seemed as though the benefits of the agreed framework far outweighed the costs of cutting such a deal. By contrast, the production of plutonium and test of a nuclear device a decade later during the six-party talks forced forced the North Koreans to contemplate giving up this entire nuclear infrastructure and capability that they had developed in return for cutting a grand bargain and reaping rewards from the US. So let me connect these findings about the Goldilocks zone back to the policy question I asked at the outset. What's the best path forward for limiting the spread of enrichment or processing technology? Now, this isn't an abstract historical question that's confined to some of the cases I've discussed here today. I think that the next presidential administration needs to be prepared to weather a coming storm over the spread of ENR technology for two reasons. First, traditional supply-side barriers are going to start to erode over the coming years. India, Pakistan, Iran, and North Korea have all mastered the nuclear fuel cycle, but remain outside the nuclear suppliers group. With the exception of India, these countries are unlikely to meet the membership requirements anytime soon. If Pakistan's bid to join the NSG, for instance, is rebuffed, Islamabad may decide to strike out on its own to help countries such as Saudi Arabia develop enrichment programs in a very above-board sense. Furthermore, there might be new manufacturing technologies coming down the pipeline that would enable the transfer and production of dual-use components around the globe. Second, the political demand for ENR may increase over time. The Iran agreement lays out a path for the international community to accept and legitimize its enrichment program. Several US allies that have been model citizens of the non-proliferation regime feel as though they should also be allowed to pursue full nuclear fuel cycle services without incurring Washington's wrath. On a normative level, mastering enrichment may soon become enshrined as an alluring status symbol. And from a strategic perspective, countries may believe that retaining an advanced nuclear program will allow them to reap deterrence benefits by hedging without actually having to produce nuclear weapons. So given these two trends in supply and demand, the key question for the next presidential administration caught up in this storm is going to be whether the US should bargain with countries, especially our allies, to buy out their demand for ENR technology. Now, should Washington try and entice countries from wanting this technology in the first place by offering rewards? Or should the US wait until a country actually acquires this technology to strike a deal? Now, the Goldilocks Principle underscores that nuclear bluffs with too little technology provide Washington with a prime opportunity. US officials can probe whether modest deliverables could convince a country to forego the development of enrichment or processing technology. As the South Koreans and the Saudis found out, Washington is going to reject expensive demands if a country doesn't have any real nuclear capabilities to trade away. But US officials are then in a great position to counter with a cheaper package designed to keep the potential proliferator from ever moving into the technical Goldilocks zone. This does raise an obvious moral hazard. An ally could summon up a nuclear program from thin air, inflate demands, and then bargain down to a realistic package of reassurance deliverables. The Saudis, for instance, seem to know that they were never going to get a formal treaty pact with the US because Congress would have to ratify such an accord. So perhaps the Saudi nuclear gambit was actually designed to accomplish more modest objectives, such as boosting the value and quality of US military hardware provided under another arms deal. The US, I think, should embrace the moral hazard of buying out these empty threats from our allies because we're going to have to spend much more if a country actually moves into the Goldilocks zone and acquires an enrichment or a processing capability. Once a state surmounts these technical barriers to enriching uranium or processing plutonium, US options to stop or delay proliferation become quite limited. In the South Korean case, for example, the US government risked a heavy-handed démarche precisely because once they acquired plutonium processing technology, it would be very difficult and expensive to get them to reverse course. Complying with a country's demands in exchange for a binding promise to forego ENR technology may be the least worst option for dealing with this sort of technology, as well as the final chance to cut a deal on the cheap. If a nuclear program is akin to a railroad train going down the tracks, then this Goldilocks zone is really the last stop where the US can most readily apply pressure and offer rewards to either stop the train or move it onto a civilian course. As the Iran deal that was just concluded in July underscores, it is still possible to reach an agreement at a higher stage of nuclear technology, but it becomes costly and at times impossible to cut a deal as the nuclear program entraps or locks in a country's leadership. The U.S. must create a situation whereby the price of giving up that nuclear program is dwarfed by the cost of incurring more punishment from economic sanctions, let's say, or foregoing the rewards of whatever we're offering at the bargaining table. In the case of Iran, Washington identified the regime's vulnerability to the international energy market and was able to devise a multinational sanctions coalition to place real pressure on the regime to come to the table. With the North Koreans, however, it was simply not possible to entice them away from the bomb once they were locked in. So to end on a positive note, though, I believe that the next presidential administration will be able to deal with the coming storm of ENR technology if they make allies offers they simply can't refuse. The list of nuclear-capable adversaries beyond Iran is paper thin. So if the focus starts to shift back towards U.S. allies in a non-proliferation sense over the coming years, I think it's going to be important to avoid conflating capability and intent to bargain with us in this way. In East Asia, for example, the threats made in the 1970s are currently anathema to the current governments in Tokyo and Seoul. Both alliances with the U.S. have matured into healthy relationships, and the political leaders of each country are firmly locked in to civilian energy programs. As a result, Japan and South Korea have the capability but no intent to threaten proliferation this way. In the Middle East, however, there's a very different story at play. The Saudis and other anxious nations have clear intent, but currently lack the capabilities needed to pressure Washington. Since these countries are not yet locked into the Goldilocks Zone, U.S. officials may be able to prevent the spread of ENR technology in this volatile region by buying out these ambitions over the coming years. But effectively executing such a policy obviously requires close collaboration between the policy community in the Beltway and the technical community writ large. So I look forward to your comments and questions over the coming minutes. Thank you.